For today's lecture, I would like to talk about the current status of livestock production in Alaska. And first talk about numbers. And I came up with a list of very rough estimates for the current number of livestock in Alaska. And yak, I believe there's currently about 300 animals under production. But again, this is a very rough estimate. Bison and the estimate is about 1,200 animals, and these are only animals under captivity behind fence. There are populations considered wildlife and feral populations, but the bison held behind fence, I estimate there's about 1,200 animals. Most of the bison are in some large herds on Kodiak and Popof Island. Elk, there's 14 registered herds of elk in the state of Alaska, and approximately 300 to 400 animals. Muskox, very few under production, most of them at the Muskox farm in Palmer, and statewide maybe 100 to 150 animals, not very many at all. And cattle across the state, we have approximately 14,000 cattle across the state of Alaska, but that number also includes dairy cattle as well. So not all of the 14,000 cattle are under meat production. And reindeer, right now we across the Seward Peninsula and the islands and the mainland populations, we have about 15,000 reindeer in the state of Alaska. And if you look at meat production, cattle provide most of Alaska's meat production, and but if you look at it as overall meat production, it really is very insignificant, both across the country and in the state. The state of Alaska is, we have a very large land mass, a lot of grazing resources, and at best we produce maybe 2 million pounds of beef a year, and this is probably one of the lowest production of any state in the nation. As far as reindeer, the current population, most of the current population is on the Seward Peninsula. We have fairly large herds on the St. Lawrence Island, Nunivak Island. There's animals, 300 to 400 out on the Pribilof Islands. Umnak, there's quite a few reindeer in Atka, and we have reindeer behind fence, Palmer, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and the Delta area. And currently, the reindeer industry, the majority of the industry, the majority of the animals are free-ranged out on the Seward Peninsula. Individuals have these grazing allotments on public land, federal, state, and some corporation land where they run reindeer. And the reindeer are under a free-range system, and animals are allowed to forage across the landscape for most of the year with very little intervention by humans, but they are brought into corral systems twice a year, usually in the winter. The snow machines are used to bring animals, the reindeer, into corral systems, and they are also brought in during the summer. And the animals are brought into the corral for a number of reasons. They receive some veterinary care, some vaccinations. Animals are given ear tags. All the animals are censused because, after all, this is an animal production system, and keeping good herd records is very important to have a very efficient, profitable animal production system. And the Reindeer Research Program has worked with a lot of the reindeer producers to develop an online computerized record-keeping system that keeps track of every animal as a unique year tag, and there's a life history record that goes along with that year tag. We know the weight of the animal when it comes through the corral, when it was vaccinated, if it had a calf or not. And that record-keeping system has been very useful to manage the reindeer herds. And the reindeer industry was doing very well in the 1980s and 1990s. There was 15 to 16 herds. At minimum, there was 1,500 animals in the smallest herds, up to possibly 8,000 animals in one herd out of Nome. There was likely 40 to 50,000 reindeer under production in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and the future for the industry looked very bright. The producers were talking about building a slaughter facility. There was a lot of attention by the state and other investors that, wow, it really looked like the reindeer industry really was going to feed a lot of Alaskans and generate considerable revenue. But as usual, during the first lecture I talked about this is a history of failure. Well, something happened that threw a wrench in the works into this success. There was a caribou herd, the Western Arctic caribou herd, in northern central Alaska. The population increased tremendously through the 80s and 90s and reached approximately 500,000 animals. Well, the Western Arctic caribou herd in the winter of 1996 changed their winter migration pattern, and a large number of animals, probably 100,000 animals, swept onto the Seward Peninsula on these traditional reindeer grazing grounds. And they just came in overnight. And so you have tens of thousands of reindeer mixed in with 100,000 caribou. It was very difficult for the producers to keep track of their animals, and so many of the reindeer commingled with caribou herds. When the caribou migrated out, the reindeer went with them. So starting in 1996, many producers were losing quite a few animals. And by the mid-2000s, we lost 80 to 90% of the industry. There was quite a few producers, reindeer producers. They lost all of their animals to caribou, and some of them are they just have a few animals left, but they don't have enough animals to be economically viable. But the reindeer industry was and still has a lot of potential to provide a lot of meat for Alaska because we have a tremendous amount of rangeland out there. There's two ways reindeer meat can end up into the food system. In the state of Alaska, reindeer producers are given a waiver by the state where field slaughtered animals can be sold to consumers. It still has to be done in a hygienic manner. Reindeer, they have to be shot, dispatched in the head or the neck. There has to be snow on the ground. The ambient air temperature has to be lower than freezing. The animal has to be quickly eviscerated and skinned. The carcass has to be allowed to freeze immediately, which doesn't do much for meat quality, but the carcass has to be frozen immediately. It can't be processed in the field anymore, except it can be halved. And after it's frozen, it can be transported into a village or wherever and sold to a wholesaler. the product, the reindeer meat, has to stay frozen. It can be processed, but it has to be processed frozen. And then it can be packaged and sold, but it has to be labeled as an uninspected product, and it has to be, because it's not an inspected product, it has to be cooked to an internal temperature of 105-60 degrees Fahrenheit. This allows for uninspected reindeer meat to get into the food system, and it's worked very well so far. The reindeer producers are able to put in a very wholesome product into the food production system. But this meat isn't. It cannot be sold in restaurants, and it cannot be mixed with other inspected meat products. It can't be mixed with pork or beef in a sausage, for example. And reindeer sausage happens to be a very valuable commodity, very much in demand. The other way for reindeer meat to get into the food production system is go through an inspection process. And reindeer meat can undergo two inspection processes. One, it's a slaughter has to be under a USDA inspection regulations, or the state of Alaska will also do an inspected reindeer slaughter. Currently, there are only 4 locations all across Alaska that will do inspected slaughters. There's Mount McKinley Meats in Palmer. There's Delta Meat and Sausage in Delta. There's Mid-State Meats midway between Fairbanks and North Pole. And there's a private individual, Nathan Mudd, on Kodiak Island that runs a mobile slaughter facility. Hopefully, in 2014, the University of Alaska will have a teaching mobile slaughter plant up and running, and we will be able to put out an inspected reindeer product this year in 2014. For meat to get into the food supply system, it has to go under inspection. In 1906, Congress passed an act, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, where all meat going into the food system and interstate commerce has to go under federal inspection. Some states have a state meat inspection service, and there is some interstate movement of the meat, and Alaska is one of these states. But why do we need inspection? Why did Congress pass the Meat Inspection Act? And it's because we, as the public, we want a very wholesome product getting into the food system, and we want to make sure the animals are slaughtered humanely and the meat is processed and stored under very sanitary, wholesome conditions. Some other legislation further firmed up this meat inspection process. In 1906, the Meat Inspection Act was passed. In 1926, there was inspection of poultry products. And in 1938, there was a practice you could slaughter your livestock on the farm, and then it could be shipped to a processing facility where it could be processed and sold. Well, in 1938, that procedure was stopped, and so you no longer could slaughter your own animals, on the farm and put them in the food system. They had to go to a slaughter plant. And in 1958, Congress passed the Humane Slaughter Act, where any animal that is slaughtered under inspection has to be dispatched in a humane manner. But what are the basic functions of a federal meat inspection? We want to make sure we detect any diseased animals or any contaminated meat before it gets into the production system. We want to make sure the product is handled in a sanitary manner. And what's very important, we need to minimize any microbial contamination. Now there's some pretty nasty bugs out there, E. coli, salmonella. You hear about meat recalls all the time, and some of these bacteria microbes end up getting into some meat, and we have to ensure we do the best job possible in keeping these very dangerous pathogens out of the meat. We want to ensure during the processing the meat product isn't adulterated at all, and when you buy the product, a meat product, we want to make sure you get what you're paying for, that the product is actually matches what is on the label. That no uninspected meat goes through the whole procedures, so the carcass is stamped. And this federal inspection, if you're a livestock producer, it's very important. Who's going to pay for this inspection? The government will pay for inspection of an amenable species. What I mean by an amenable species is the traditional livestock. The USDA will pay, if you're a cattle producer, USDA will pay for the inspection process during the slaughter of your cattle. But unfortunately, many of the livestock animals in Alaska are classified as non-amenable species, like elk and reindeer. And so if you want to slaughter a non-amenable species under inspection, then you, the producer, have to pay for the inspection. You have to pay the salary, the wages of the inspector, and all the travel costs associated with it. So it is pretty costly and likely one of the reasons livestock production in Alaska is at a minimum, is because we have so few animals to slaughter, and there's all these fairly high associated costs. This amenable slaughter, the U.S. government will pay for an 8-hour shift. You have to make sure your animals are slaughtered in an 8-hour shift, and if it goes into overtime, you're responsible. The inspector, he will not only inspect the process, but he'll make the facilities are meet all the regulations and the protocols. The rail height, you don't want carcasses dragging on the floor. You want to make sure all the materials in the slaughter plant are a good washable surface. And you want to make sure no vermin, insects, or anything else get inside into the slaughter plant. And actually what's very important, to make sure you have good lighting so you can see the product and see if there's any problems. During the inspection process, the inspector will come out and do an ante-mortem inspection. He'll want to look at the animals before they're slaughtered, before they're killed, to make sure they're in good condition. And after the animal is slaughtered, he will go ahead and then do a post-mortem inspection of the carcass. And during the process, if the inspector finds anything wrong with the carcass, he will condemn it, and it will not go into the food system. In 1990, the meat industry established some rules, a formal set of protocols that all slaughter facilities must follow. Every slaughter facility that does a USDA inspected slaughter must develop a HACCP plan. And a HACCP plan is just identifying the critical points during the process that something can go wrong, where you can contaminate the meat. And you need to identify those areas, and you also need to identify how you are going to eliminate or not allow any contamination at all. And if there is a contamination event, how are you going to deal with this? And it's you have to develop this very standardized protocol, and it has to be approved by USDA, or in the case of the state, by the state of Alaska. Okay, in these HACCP plans, we will conduct a hazard analysis, and we will determine the critical points where things can go wrong, and establish what's right and what's wrong, and how are we going to monitor what we do. And if something goes wrong, what are the corrective actions we can take? Is the meat product pulled out? Do we clean and wash the facility? What do we do to ensure that only a wholesome meat product continues down the production system? And of course, we have to keep records of the whole process, so there is a very rigid record keeping and documentation process of the HACCP plan. The critical points, the protocols, it's based on very good meat science, and it focuses the responsibility on the facility manager and the producer to follow a very standardized and rigid hygienic process, and that it's well documented and monitored. And because we want to make sure we have a very safe and a very marketable product, both across the states and for international markets. That's what we're hoping for a lot of Alaskan livestock products, is maybe we can develop a future international market. Along with the HACCP plans, we also develop SOPs, standard operating procedures, how we're going to clean up the facility after we're done processing for the day. After the carcass has been slaughtered according to the HACCP plan, and we get a good, clean, wholesome carcass at the end, then the inspector will go ahead and put that very valuable stamp on it. It's been inspected and approved, and then it's safe to be put into the food system. Okay, across the country, 15 states also have state inspection services. The state of Alaska is one of them, but only for reindeer. The state does not inspect any other livestock species except for reindeer. The state inspection regulations, protocols, must meet the federal USDA inspection standards, and you have to develop a HACCP plan in order to fall under Alaska state inspection. And if a producer, reindeer producer, wants to go under state inspection rather than USDA inspection, he can do that. And pay for the inspection services. And the state inspection stamp, and with the state inspection stamp, that carcass can be sold within the state. It can be sold to other states, and it can be sold internationally, as long as the other countries and the other states will recognize and accept the state stamp of inspection. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've developed a HACCP plan, an SOP under supervision, oversight from the state meat inspector and the state veterinarian, and they do run a very tight ship. You have got to you have to ensure you have a very wholesome, clean slaughter when you slaughter reindeer. But once you undergo a federal or a state inspection, you can put your product out into the marketplace, but you still have to follow further protocols. You have to make sure your meat product is labeled properly. You have to have the product name. You have to have the name and the address of the company where it came from. You have to have your inspection stamp, the location where it came from, and if there's any special handling instructions, keep it refrigerated, keep it frozen, or cooking temperatures. You have to cook the product to a certain temperature. Those have to be on your meat label as well. And these are a requirement to put your product out into the marketplace. You also have to include a nutritional label along with your product as well. What is the calorie, what is the fat content, cholesterol, sodium. We've all seen these nutritional labels on the food. Every piece of meat that goes into the food system, into the marketplace, has to have one of these nutritional labels on it.